morning, everyone, and I'm Don Keelan, and this is the program, the Civil Discourse, and this morning I have with me my co-host, Andrew McKeever. Welcome, Andy.
Hey, good to be here.
And we also have with us a special guest from Chicago, Dr. Russell Johnson with the University of Chicago. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
A little background on Dr. Johnson. He earned his Master's of Theological Studies, I should say, from Duke University, and has an MA and a PhD from the University of Chicago. Dr. Johnson is the Assistant Director of the Undergraduate Religious Studies program at the university and a columnist for the magazine The Sightings. And that's a publication of the Martin Marty Center, the University of Chicago Divinity School, and the goal is for public understanding of religion. Dr. Johnson oversees studies in religious ethics and the philosophy of communication. His work draws upon rhetorical theory, Christian theology, peace and conflict studies, and dialogical philosophy to explore how the good guys versus the bad guys and how their mindset distorts people's perception of themselves and their opponents. And here I always thought a divinity school was a college to teach about the Bible, the saints, Jesus, and the history of Christianity. I guess I'm wrong. Could you explain a little bit more about the Marty Center very briefly to us?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Martin Marty, as many of you may know, is a historian of American religion and has been for decades one of the most preeminent and well-respected historians of religion in America. And in part because of his work, he taught at the University of Chicago. The Martin Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion was founded a few years ago, I believe in the 90s, and they do work helping people understand the different ways that religion intersects with politics, popular culture, society, etc. Because understanding how religion operates within a society is a fundamental component of dialogue, conversation, protest, and the other ways that we live together within a society.
Well, let's get right to a serious topic that you have worked on in the past and presently, and that is polarization and how people can speak to one another across lines of political disagreement. Can you help us with that?
Yeah, I don't know if I can help you, but I'm certainly able to talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah, as I understand, there are a few different kinds of polarization when people use the term polarization. So one form of polarization is elite polarization, which is to say that's how people, for example, in Congress, whether the people on the left are able to get along with and pass legislation alongside with people on the right. So that's one form of polarization, is elite polarization. Another form of polarization is ideological polarization, which is to say how far apart people actually are in terms of their political beliefs. So when you give out questionnaires to people asking them, what are your thoughts on these particular issues, how much it fits into two rival camps rather than a lot of different beliefs with a lot of different shades of gray, as it were. And then there's affective polarization is the third kind of polarization, and that's how people feel about one another, how liberals feel about conservatives and how conservatives feel about liberals, whether there is a sense that, they're generally good people that I disagree with, or they're fundamentally wrong in a dangerous way to our society and I don't want to interact with them. And then the last kind of polarization is perceived polarization, which is how the degree to which people take the two camps within society to be divergent on issues. And one of the things that we see in America is that there is ideological polarization. Clearly, there are people who have very strong disagreements, but that has not been increasing at quite the rate that it may seem like. So there's much higher perceived polarization and much higher affective polarization. That is, people tend to think that there are two big groups on the right and the left and tends to be distrustful of the opposing group that they take themselves to be in. But that is, in an interesting way, disproportionate to the actual disagreements that occur, because every person has relatively unique political beliefs. And so although this has happened less and less over the last 60 years, individual people may have a wide variety of views, but when the time comes to start arguing about politics, we tend to start thinking in red versus blue ways. And that sort of there are two camps and they don't like each other approach is what I think is the most dangerous aspect of polarization.
Okay.
If I can jump in here. This is all really interesting stuff here, Dr. Johnson, and what you're talking about is kind of what we've been kind of trying to discuss and deal with over the past year or so since we've had our program here on civil discourse, as we recognize the the difficulty so many people seem to be having with just sort of talking to each other in a calm, civil fashion. Even if they didn't agree about something, they could at least do it in a reasonable way. So those four areas that you talked about were really quite interesting. I guess I just wondered, I mean, political polarization and cultural polarization, the kind of thing we're sort of seeing a lot of now, it seems like, isn't anything new. I mean, we've had moments of polarization in the country's history, probably going back to, well, when the when the Pilgrims first landed in Plymouth Rock, probably. But I guess I just wondered, to what do you attribute the current kind of polarization we're seeing at the moment to in particular? Is there any sort of source point moment that you can say, hey, things kind of went from, reasonable to unreasonable because of this, or a chain of events? Does anything like that stand out to you?
I mean, there are a few different episodes. If you're going to tell the story of how we got here, you got to go back at least to the 60s, if not further back. And to tell a story that there's not simply one cause. It's not like everything was great and then social media came around and now things aren't great. A lot of it has to do with people. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy when you start to think that there are two fundamentally different and opposed kinds of people within America, ideologically. And so the more people rely on that rhetoric of us versus them, the more it becomes a reality. Precisely because people then tend to join together more with the people who they take to be part of their us. And start to define themselves more and more in opposition to them. So a lot of historians of polarization, I'm thinking here of Liliana Mason, who wrote a terrific book, Uncivil Agreement, which is about sort of the story of how starting with the Southern strategy in the 60s and moving onward, politicians began narrating the opposition within our society more and more in those terms, and try in a way to achieve electoral victory, to sort of build enough of a coalition based on racial animosity, based on economic ideology, to where it became more and more of a cohesive thing. What's interesting is that if 60 or so years ago, it was not that unusual for a person to narrate themselves as liberal, but also a Republican. Or maybe they were socially conservative, but fiscally more leaning towards socialism or something like that. And over the years, our identities and our identifications have congealed, or that's not the right word, but come together to the point where now, I mean, you can tell a lot about the politics of a person by where they do their grocery shopping, for instance, or what sort of car they drive, what sort of news station they tune into, and so on. And so the idea that there are two different kind of people is, as I mentioned, I mean, it's still not fundamentally true, but the more we think that way, the more we tend to live around and talk with people that we take to be part of in us, then the more it actually does become the case.
For the lay person, could you define the difference between disagreement and polarization?
That's a great question. I mean, the easiest way to understand it is that if you've got a room full of 100 people who disagree, then you may hear 100 different opinions. We can imagine a very chaotic, but hopefully very productive town hall where people are able to express their own different views. Whereas if you have a room full of 100 people that is polarized, you're largely going to only hear two different opinions, and they're going to be expressed antagonistically as mutually exclusive opposites. So polarization, I mean, we can think of it like polarization in a magnet or something like that. It's necessarily reducing a wide diversity of opinions into a binary. You're either with us or you're with them. You either support this or you're against it. In a way that increases animosity, usually precisely because then we're thinking more in terms of how do we beat them than thinking in terms of how do all of us with our various different concerns and priorities and reasons arrive together at what is most true and what is most just and what's best for our community. So that's how I define polarization. It's not necessarily the more intense form of disagreement, but it's the kind of disagreement where the us versus them way of thinking is more likely to take over and get in the way of weighing a lot of different voices, weighing a lot of different concerns in the process of figuring out what's best.
So how do we get out of that? I guess that's always the question I come back to is like, okay, we've gotten to a point where it's hard for people who live in different communities, because it seems like one of the big things that's been going on in the country over the last 20, 30, 40 years has been this sort of self-sorting of people into, people want to live with people who are like them already. And it makes it even harder to break down those barriers that come up. But what do you see a pathway that we could exploit to kind of break through that and realize that someone who lives in, let's say, Appalachia, you know, in many ways is coping with the same issues as someone who lives in New England or out in the Midwest?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few different ways forward. I'll talk about two. One of them is more political structural, and it's to change up the way we think about elections. Maybe introducing something like ranked choice voting. Because again, part of what polarization thrives on is a sense of there are fundamentally two different ideas, fundamentally two different ways of being, two different ideologies, and what's good for our side is what's bad for their side, and what's bad for their side is good for our side. And so the more we can make politics a matter of what is it that you actually care about, what is it that you actually want, what candidates do you actually support, then people will be voting and arguing more in terms of their own actual needs and priorities, rather than the more tribalistic is the term that some sociologists use, rather than the more us versus them ways of thinking that again just sort of spiral off. And so things like ranked choice voting or other ways of breaking that great binary that is characteristic of American politics can have important effects on the ways people reimagine the political situation in ways other than simply red versus blue, which I think is not doing a service to anyone. I mean, so few people, if you'll ask them, how do you really feel about the last presidential candidate you voted for, will say, yeah, that person really stood for what I believe in. There's more of a sort of begrudging, like, well, it's better than the other guys, which I mean, maybe that's inevitable in politics to some extent, but studies have shown that there are other forms of structuring elections that make it less winner takes all and more let's get the right people in positions of power, and that actually has trickle-down effects to the ways that we treat one another and the ways that we think about politics. On a more practical individual level, I mean, I think trying to put yourself in position where you can talk to and listen to people who disagree with you without that conversation being structured in us versus them ways where you feel like you have to represent your group. There's a great book by Julia Galef called The Scout Mindset, and she describes the difference between what she calls the scout mindset, which is a way of thinking that all of us are capable of, where what you're doing is being like a scout. You're trying to figure out what's out there, what's the terrain really like, what's actually going on. You're motivated by curiosity and interest, and not necessarily your preconceptions. And then there's the soldier mindset, which is the other mindset that, again, all of us are capable of, where you're feeling defensive, you're feeling like you have to protect your side and be opposed to the other side, You feel threatened often and lash out because of that. And the more we have political conversations where we are operating out of the soldier mindset and we are talking in ways that encourage other people to operate out of that soldier mindset, to where, okay, now I'm representing my side and you feel like you have to represent your side to oppose my side because you don't want to lose, and you want to save face or something like that. Then we're both soldiers opposing one another rather than scouts trying to figure out what we actually care about and what's actually right. And so I think there are ways of having a conversation and ways of preparing yourself to have a conversation. This is possible online, but in person is clearly better because and this is possible with a crowd in front of you, but if you have a crowd listening to what it is that you have to say, including a crowd of people looking at your social media posts, for instance, then you're more inclined to be performing for your own side rather than actually listening to and engaging with the other side. So I think not just listening to and talking to people who disagree with you, but doing so in contexts when both you and them can actually be open to the idea of trying to understand what the other person is saying, rather than incentivizing a sort of knee-jerk reaction where you have to silence or dismiss the concerns that they're raising.
Dr. Johnson, let me ask you, you're in the School of Divinity, and you must work, how do you address the fact that you have various religions, and them versus us? How do you reconcile that with your students and with so many different issues among the various religious groups?
What's interesting is that a lot of the different religions around the world have reasons within them, resources within them for loving those and being present with those who you might otherwise take to be your enemy. So for instance, you mentioned the Bible. Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And a lot of the work that the Apostle Paul tells people to undertake is the work of reconciliation, fundamentally between Jews and Gentiles. It's one of the big divisions in the New Testament era, but other divisions, whether racial or ideological, since then, our Christianity is fundamentally about a way of being together with other people beyond us versus them ways of thinking. And we see similar attitudes in, for instance, Buddhism, where there's this idea that everyone in a past life could have been your brother, your sister, your mother, your father. So what unites us and what connects us once we truly understand how we're all interconnected is more fundamentally profound and deeper than the sense of self, the illusory sense of self that we have that drives us into hatred, which in Buddhist teaching, hatred is one of the three poisons that gets in the way of living a life toward enlightenment. And we could go on. There are similar resources within Islam, certainly within Hinduism, within Taoism, of getting over the human tendency to define in us by in opposition to a them, and instead to figure out how we can get at the truth together and how we can appreciate the value of each person beyond simply the categories we're inclined to put them in. So the great irony is, of course, that religions, including the ones that I just mentioned, can easily become pretenses for the sorts of categorization, division, and us versus them ways of thinking. There are countless historical examples of that happening. But I also think that within each of those traditions, there are those resources. And it's really interesting for me to explore those with my students.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Go ahead. Well, the other one I was going to, getting back to the current issue of polarization that we were bringing up, is it safe to say that the politicians and the media, they're driving the bus here on this issue, or in your opinion, or?
Somewhat. They're certainly not doing very much to make it better, but in part the politicians are giving the people what they think the people want, and the voters in a lot of cases are rewarding exactly that sort of behavior. So the politicians, we can't simply point the blame at them and say, the voting populace is great, it's these politicians. Part of the reason why politicians, or especially candidates, when they're running for election or re-election, is instead of playing on people's best interests, the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln said, politicians have found out that one of the easiest ways to motivate voter turnout is to motivate outrage at what the other side is doing. I don't mean to create a false equivalence. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that are genuinely worth being outraged about, and it's not necessarily wrong to vote against a candidate, trying to keep them out of office, rather than simply voting for the candidate or the party or the platform that you support. But we see now more and more investment, especially from people on the Republican side, of to where their main platform is the opposing that which they take to be the Democrats' policies or the Democratic agenda. And so we see a lot of boogeymen being used by the politicians and drummed up. The debates over critical race theory, for instance, as a move to drive people to the polls, based not on a sober, thoughtful scout mindset assessment of what's actually good for their communities and which politicians are best able to provide that, but out of this sort of fear and this antagonism that gets in the way of actually reflecting on what works. So that is to say, I think politicians are certainly feeding off of it, but in a way that we're the ones who give them power, and so the voters can't simply point the blame at the elites for doing what it is that they're doing.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why it is that people find it so easy to believe in stereotypes of another side.
There's an organization called Braver Angels, formerly called Better Angels, and what they do is they go around the nation hosting workshops, and every workshop is 50% people who identify as red, that is more on the conservative side, and 50% people who identify as blue. And the workshops are structured not, okay, now debate, but rather reds be silent for a second and listen to the blues reflect on what it is they actually care about and what they think reds think of them, and then blues, now you stay silent for a while and listen to what the reds, again, this reds, that's their term for it, how they narrate what it is that actually drives their political beliefs, and how they actually understand you and think about who you are. And so I think those exercises like that, even if you only go to one of them, that can be transformative, because then it's easier to put a human face to an ideology that's different than the one that's being presented to you in the media. One of the dangerous tendencies is we tend to take particular representatives to stand in for the whole. And so that you'll see a lot of liberals who, when they think of Republicans, they think of Donald Trump, for instance, which is not entirely unfair. I mean, he did win the election, but there's so much diversity of opinion, diversity of motivation, diversity of viewpoint within even these two big monolithic groups that make up the American political system, and that includes sort of our geographical identities. So the more we can recognize that each person is an individual and that they may have political beliefs that we strongly disagree with and need to challenge, then we're more likely to see them as a person that we can interact with, rather than simply one more example of an ideology that we already know what's wrong with it. And so again, this does not mean that, once you see the humanity in another person, we see that we're all alike and everything's gravy. Rather, it's you're able to have real disagreements with the person you're actually disagreeing with, then each side lobbying objections to a stereotype or a caricature of what they take to be the other person's beliefs that doesn't actually hit the mark, because you're striking at a straw man, as it were, or rather you're striking against the representative of those beliefs that might not actually hold them. And so keeping in mind the fact that whoever the we is, we don't necessarily agree with everything the public figures on our side are saying, and extending that same charity to the people that we actually interact with. I think that's one of the most helpful ways to break down our own tendency to stereotype.
Can you tell us about the Jewish philosopher who I know you've shared with us, Martin Buber, and what was his address, the significance of his address in 1952 when he said, "Hope for this hour"? How can we close with that, and how can you share that?
Absolutely. It's a terrific address that the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber gave in 1952 here in America, in New York. And what he was talking about in the context of the time was the Cold War. So his description of a world that's divided into two fundamentally opposed camps, he saw that as an existential problem. Humanity's inability to resolve their disagreements through discourse necessitates that the only way to resolve our disagreements is through violence. And so for Buber, he saw the inability for people to talk with people that they disagree with, not just as a sort of casual inconvenience, but as a major threat to the well-being of the human race. And I think a lot of the lessons from that speech remain pertinent as we think about the context of American polarization, which some people have referred to as a kind of cold civil war that's simmering. One of the things that he talks about is the point that I just made. There's a difference between individual mistrust and what he called massive mistrust. So there are people who, by their actions, have proven themselves to be the sort of people where you can't take what they say at face value. And you have to be suspicious of the fact that they are pressing some sort of agenda or lying. And that tendency toward individual mistrust is healthy and important, as it's part of how we figure out who to believe and who not to believe. For Buber, part of the problem of his age, and I would say similarly our age, is we've moved into massive mistrust, to where liberals think they no longer need to listen to what conservatives say they care about because they already think they know what the conservative agenda is. And similarly, conservatives think, I see, we know what you really want and what you're really trying to do. And so it's not just I disagree with what you say. It's I don't even need to listen to what you have to say or to pay attention to it because I already know what your real agenda is. And for Buber, that tendency toward massive mistrust is an issue that we have to restrain. And for him, the answer is not simply to become more credulous or to become more naive, but rather to become more aware of our own tendencies to stereotype and to caricature and be what he called critical of our criticism. So realize that the lenses through which we interpret the motivations of others tend to be overly narrow, and to take a minute and be more reflective about, okay, is this actually what this other person is saying that they care about or saying that they want, or is this actually the vision of a better society that they're fighting for, or am I fighting against my own projections of what I take to be their position because of it's the mirror opposite of what I'm fighting against. So I think keeping in mind that what you voted against is not necessarily what they're voting for, and that there are real people with real positions that may challenge your own assumptions about what you think they must want. Is something that Buber, that in that address specifically, and in his other writings on dialogue, continues to have something to say to our times.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us this morning, and we really appreciate it, and it's going to go a long way on our show. So, Dr. Johnson, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.